They say the British packed up and left India in 1947, but sometimes it feels like they just changed the locks and left the manual behind. Today, India's economy is worth over $4 trillion, a staggering figure that politicians love to shout from podiums. But zoom in and you'll find a curious detail. India's GDP per capita ranks just a few notches above nations still dealing with little war zones. It's like owning a mansion, but the residents are still crammed into the basement. The world's largest democracy, they call it, where journalists are raided before breakfast and press freedom drops faster than the rupee, where elected officials campaign not on vision but on which community you should probably start hating this election cycle. A place where ancient fault lines, caste, religion, language are still mined for votes generation after generation. The British may have left, but their ghost still sits at the desk, stamping files in triplicate. Bureaucracy, check. Communal divisions, weaponized. Surveillance, updated with 5G. And perhaps most poetically, the very colonial law used to jail Gandhi is still used today, just with different targets and a shinier courtroom. This audiobook is not about bashing India, far from it. It's about understanding how we got here, because to grasp the chaos of the present, we need to revisit the circus that was the past. This is not your standard tale of empire, the kind told with violence and powdered wigs. No, this is the story of how a group of tea merchants, armed with shipping contracts and staggering overconfidence, accidentally took over a subcontinent. This is the story of corporate coups, cultural confusion, economic exploitation, and a long list of things you should absolutely not do if you're trying to run a country. This is How Not to Rule a Country. The British in India. Chapter 1. The Accidental Empire. It all started with spices. Not gold, not God, just a slightly more exciting dinner. In 1600s, a bunch of English merchants dressed like they had walked into a Shakespearean cosplay convention convinced Queen Elizabeth I to sign a royal charter for a trading venture. They called it the East India Company, a modest, not so humble startup aimed at muscling in on the Asian spice trade. Their goal: nutmeg, clove, pepper, the kind of things that now sit neglected in the back of your kitchen cabinet. But the Dutch were already here, and the Portuguese had swords. So the English did what they soon became famous for: smile, flatter, bribe, and wait. When they arrived in Mughal India, they weren't conquerors, they were groupies. The Mughal court had more jewels than an Instagram filter. The streets of Delhi and Agra hummed with poetry, perfume, and power. The English were stunned, awed, mildly insecure. So they set up factories, not the industrial kind, but little trading posts, beginning in Surat and Madras. They asked nicely, offered gifts, and tried not to offend anyone with too much Christianity. Yet. But here's where the comedy kicks in. The East India Company was a business, a literal company. No army, no navy, no real authority beyond their paperwork. But business in India wasn't that simple. There were warlords, rival traders, pirates, and of course the French. Always the French. So they started hiring guards. Then those guards needed leaders, and suddenly the merchants had officers. Before long, they had forts, cannons, and soldiers marching in formation, all under the gentle umbrella of protecting trade. Imagine your local supermarket slowly building a private army and casually annexing a few neighborhoods around you. That's what the East India Company did, and no one back home in London really understood. or cared, as long as the profits kept rolling in. But this creeping militarization wasn't just about defense, it was about dominance. Dutch competition, shoot it. Local resistance, buy it. Mughal decline, exploit it. The company's rise was less a master plan and more a long, chaotic tumble upward, tripping over collapsing empires, bribing confused kings, and misunderstanding almost every cultural signal they encountered. All the while, they dressed it up with speeches about civilization and progress. Because nothing says moral superiority like storming a city, charging the survivor's interest. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the East India Company, this rat-rack bunch of over-ambitious tea salesmen, had gone from renting warehouses to collecting taxes from millions, an empire by accident, or perhaps by design, poorly disguised as accident. Chapter 2, From Merchants to Monarchs. June 1757. A field in Bengal. On one side, Siraj-ud-Dowla, the Nawab, young and defiant. On the other, a company clerk turned part-time general, Robert Clive, backed by a private army, a few forged letters, and a lot of misplaced confidence. The Battle of Plassey lasted about as long as an English tea break. Why? Because Siraj-ud-Dowla was betrayed, not by his enemies, but by his own generals, bought and sold like stock options by the East India Company. That day, Britain didn't just win a battle, it bought a throne, and Clive, who started his career balancing ledgers, became the unofficial king of Bengal. The empire didn't arrive with trumpets, it slipped in through the accounts department. The company was now collecting taxes from over 20 million people, but they weren't a government, they were still officially just a trading firm. So, what did they do? They did what every good corporation does when faced with unexpected success. They doubled down and looted everything: Bengal's wealth, silks, muslin, jewels, rice. Rice began flowing out, and in its place came ledgers, quotas, and policy memos written in English for people who didn't speak it. They called it revenue collection. The locals called it starvation. This wasn't governance, it was profit extraction at gunpoint. The Nawabs remained, technically, but they were puppets, their strings pulled from Calcutta, their courts monitored, their decisions overruled by men who still thought cumin was spicy. Meanwhile, Clive and his successors made private fortunes, not salaries, fortunes, rich enough to buy seats in parliament back in Britain, where they lobbied to keep the gravy train running. The company now had its own army, larger than Britain's, built with Indian recruits paid in company coin. These sepoys were trained like British soldiers, dressed like British soldiers, and died in British wars, but could never be British, a fact that one day would explode. On paper, this was dual rule. In reality, it was corporate feudalism. The East India Company was running a continent with the ethics of a hedge fund and the humility of a colonial sermon. Traditional institutions collapsed, artisans were ruined, landlords either played ball or vanished, and the rural poor, they paid taxes during famines while being lectured on thrift. All this by a company originally chartered to buy pepper. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a lesson in unchecked power, privatized violence, and how not to run a country, unless your only metric for success is how much gold you can ship out by boat. Chapter 3, Tea, Opium, and Other Addictions. The most British of beverages, comforting, civilized, served at 4 p.m. with a biscuit and a war crime. By the 1800s, tea wasn't just a drink, It was a national obsession in Britain, as vital as oxygen, and apparently worth destabilizing entire civilizations for. The problem, the British were buying tea from China. China didn't want British goods, so silver had to be shipped out to pay for it, and that was unacceptable. Enter the solution only a morally bankrupt corporation could love: opium. The East India Company began mass cultivating opium in India, mostly in Bihar and Bengal, not for medicine, not for the locals, but to smuggle it into China. Yes, the same nation preaching virtue back home was now drug pushing abroad to balance trade. Farmers were coerced into abandoning food crops to grow poppy. Company agents enforced quotas, and while India starved, China got addicted. When the Chinese government complained, when they seized opium and said, "Please stop ruining our society," the British responded with gunboats. The first opium war wasn't just illegal, it was surreal. A war fought to protect the right to keep selling narcotics, and it worked. Back in India, tea was now being grown in Assam, but no one asked the locals. Forests were cleared, tribes displaced. Plantations sprouted like colonial acne across the hills, and the company, ever efficient, created a triangle of vice. India grows opium, China smokes it, Britain sips the tea and counts the profit, all wrapped in the elegant packaging of free trade. The irony: this same empire preached Christian morality, temperance, and the civilizing mission, even as it bankrolled addiction, deforestation, and famine. Profit over people, policy over humanity, and all for a cup of tea. This chapter wasn't just a footnote in economic history, it was a blueprint for global capitalism on imperial steroids, a system where human lives were spreadsheet entries and ethics were a luxury for the conquered. Chapter 4: Bureaucrats, Blunders, and Babus. If you ever wonder why the Indian bureaucracy today feels like Kafka's maze run by men with rubber stamps and tea-stained files, well, meet its great-grandfather, the British Raj. After taking control, the British didn't just want to rule, they wanted to document it. Every transaction, every birth, every land dispute, every cow sneezing near a railway track written down, filed, duplicated, and sometimes sent to London for no apparent reason. The result? An avalanche of paperwork. And so emerged a new culture of empire, the Babu, literate, often overqualified, paid to translate imperial gibberish into slightly more comprehensible gibberish. But there was a problem: language. The British, in their infinite wisdom, decided to legislate India in English, a language unknown to most Indians and often barely understood by the British themselves. Add some Persian leftovers, Sanskrit titles, and local dialects, and you had courtrooms where nobody knew what was actually happening. And when miscommunication didn't work, they simply imposed arbitrary laws. Want to walk barefoot into a temple? There's a shoe tax. Want to make salt near the ocean? Illegal. Have an opinion? Let's check that under sedition. These weren't laws, they were colonial mood swings dressed up in legality. Then came the civilizing mission, the divine duty to rescue India from its barbaric past by enforcing British moral codes, dress norms, and Victorian manners on a civilization that had bathhouses while Europe was still throwing waste out the window. They tried to reform caste without understanding it, tried to preach monogamy while profiting off brothels in barracks, tried to teach Indians not to live while running a regime built entirely on deception. And all of this was managed by a civil service so elite, so white, and so out of touch, it believed Indians couldn't govern themselves, even though Indians had been doing it for millennia. Meanwhile, the British constructed cities with segregated quarters, cantonments for whites, native towns for everyone else. Even the air was colonized. The entire system was an illusion of order masking a reality of chaos. And while India bled from the wounds of bad governance, the British patted themselves on the back for building railways, forgetting to mention those railways mostly ran to ports to ship things out. In the end, the bureaucracy became a parody of itself, a bloated, paper choked machine that enforced misrule with stunning efficiency, all while sipping Darjeeling and debating the virtues of cricket. Chapter 5: Rebellion, Rumor, and Rifle Cartridges. It began, as revolutions often do, with a whisper, a rumor, a cartridge. In 1857, sepoys in the company's army were issued new Enfield rifles. To load them, soldiers had to bite open the cartridges. Cartridges rumored to be greased with a cow and pig fat. To a Hindu, cow is sacred. To a Muslim, pig is forbidden. To British, it was just standard issue. That one rumor, dismissed by the officers as native superstition, ignited a continent. But the cartridge was just the match. The power keg had been building for years. Soldiers paid less than their British counterparts. Farmers taxed into oblivion. Artisans ruined by imported British goods. Princes humiliated, stripped of power and pride. The company had colonized not just the land but dignity, and so it exploded. In Meerut, soldiers mutinied. In Delhi, the aged Mughal emperor was reluctantly declared a symbolic figurehead. In Jhansi, a warrior queen, Rani Lakshmi Bai, rode into legend, sword in hand. In Kanpur and Lucknow, cities burned. This wasn't a rebellion, it was a scream, a collective howl against foreign rule, cultural arrogance, and economic strangulation. And how did the British respond? With paranoia and brutality. Every brown face became a suspect. Massacres followed. Entire villages were razed. Rebels were tied to cannons and blown apart. A medieval punishment revived by the modern empire. In Delhi, the British reclaimed the city with such fury that they executed civilians at random, plundered palaces, and turned sacred spaces into military barracks. The rebellion was crushed, but the myth of British invincibility shattered. The East India Company, once just a group of merchants, was now seen as too dangerous to be left in charge. In 1858, the British Crown stepped in. Queen Victoria took over, promising equality and justice in a speech likely written by men who had never set foot outside their London clubs. The irony: the company was dissolved not for its cruelty, but for its inefficiency. They hadn't failed morally, they had failed administratively. A rebellion was bad for business. What began as a rumor about a rifle cartridge had exposed an entire empire built on misunderstanding, misrule, and mercilessness, and so ended the corporate phase of British rule. What came next? A government with a flag, a queen, and the same tired delusions. Chapter 6: The Queen Takes Over. The year was 1858. The company was dead. Long live the crown. After the firestorm of rebellion, Britain realized something awkward. Leaving the governance of 300 million people to a profit chasing corporation was, in retrospect, maybe not ideal. So the British Raj was born, an official government run directly by the crown, with a new motto: "We promise not to mess this up quite as badly." Queen Victoria issued a royal proclamation, read aloud in cities across India by trembling bureaucrats. It promised religious freedom, equal treatment under law, no more annexations, and a long list of noble intentions. It was beautiful, it was poetic, and it was mostly ignored by the people writing policy. What followed wasn't reform, it was rebranding. The East India Company's offices simply became government departments. Its army, now the British Indian Army. Its system of exploitation, tweaked, polished, and expanded, now with better laws. To keep the lid on discontent, the British doubled down on surveillance. Post rebellion, India was crawling with informants, spies, and censors. Writers were watched, speakers were jailed. Even a pamphlet could be sedition if it made a white officer uncomfortable. And then came the illusion of inclusion. A select few Indians were admitted into the Indian civil service after taking exams held only in London, in English, on topics like Latin grammar and British history. This wasn't governance, it was gaslighting. Meanwhile, the Crown invented an entire class of loyal Indians, showering them with titles, honors, and medals for service like not complaining too much and occasionally agreeing with us. Then came the Darbars, grand imperial spectacles where Indian princes paraded like peacocks, paying homage to a monarch they had never met. In palaces they weren't allowed to enter. It was ruled by pageantry, operation with fireworks. And yes, the infrastructure arrived. Railways to move troops and extract resources, telegraphs to relay orders and suppress dissent, universities to produce clerks who could write letters about their own people in perfect English. They called it modernization, but it was a machine built not to uplift but to control. India had gone from being a company of commerce to a colony of command, and at the top of it all sat a queen, cloaked in velvet and virtue, ruling over millions she would never ever see from thousands of miles away. Chapter 7: Infrastructure or Illusion. Ask any apologist of British Raj what they left behind, and they'll say it with the smug satisfaction of a quiz show winner. Railways. Yes, the trains, the crown jewel of colonial infrastructure, the steel veins of progress, they say, stretching across the subcontinent, connecting people, modernizing India. But let's zoom in. Those railways, they were built to extract, not to empower. The routes weren't laid out to link cultures and economies. They were designed to move cotton, coal, and crops from the hinterland to the port. They were conveyor belts for plunder, not pathways to prosperity. The same goes for roads, paved not for peasants but for troops. In case of rebellion, famine, or heaven forbid, a protest, the British could arrive promptly and remind everyone who was the boss. The telegraph lines, not for love letters or poetry. They buzzed with coded commands to arrest revolutionaries and censor the press. And what about education? Universities were built, yes, but they discouraged critical thinking. The goal was to produce clerks, interpreters, paper pushers, and a class of Indians trained just enough to manage other Indians, but never to challenge British authority. Lord Macaulay, the man behind the education blueprint, said it best. To create a class of people, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. Translation: brown admins for white masters. That's it. Meanwhile, architecture became a tool for psychological warfare. From the grandeur of Victoria Terminus to the monstrous scale of Viceroy's house, British buildings were meant to intimidate. Visual reminders that empire was here, tall and made of stone. And yet, behind the marble facades, reality crumbled. When famines struck, they struck often. These glittering institutions failed. The British kept exporting grain while millions died here in India. Relief came late, inedible or not at all, because the system was never built to care, it was built to count. And while Indian taxpayers funded railways and monuments, the profits paid for British wars in Africa, China, and beyond. The empire grew, India shrank. They called it development. But development without autonomy, voice, or justice is just a prettier prison. Yes, the trains ran on time, but not everyone survived the journey. Chapter 8: Culture Clash and Comic Irony. If imperialism had sense of humor, it was unintentional. Picture this: a stiff British officer in starched uniform lecturing a crowd of villagers on the virtues of soap, punctuality, and proper trousers, while standing in a land that wrote the Ayurvedic texts, invented zero, and had been bathing in rivers long before the Romans figured out plumbing. Welcome to the grand comedy of cultural misunderstanding, where the British came to civilize a civilization that was older than their entire monarchy. They saw saris and called them rags. They heard Sanskrit and labeled it gibberish. They looked at temples and muttered, "Too exotic, needs a steeple." Take sati, the practice of widow immolation. Yes, it was horrific, and yes, reform was necessary. But the British approached it not with empathy, but with performative moral outrage, the kind that goes great with brandy and a newspaper editorial. They banned sati while tolerating child labor in their own factories back home. They preached virtue while pushing opium to China. They spoke of women's rights, but only if the woman in question could serve tea and quote Shakespeare. Then came the missionaries, armed with Bibles and the best intentions. They stormed into a spiritual landscape rich with philosophy, poetry, and pluralism. Language became another battlefield. The British insisted on English, even when they couldn't pronounce Bhubaneswar without choking on their cravat. Indians meanwhile learned English too well. So well they began writing scathing essays, biting satire, and eventually revolutionary pamphlets in perfect prose. The British built schools, and those schools built rebels. And then there was fashion. Indians wearing dhotis were uncivilized. Indians in suits were trying too hard. The dress code of empire was clear: be less Indian, but not too British. Stay somewhere in the colonized middle. Yet, slowly, the joke began turning. Indian lawyers in courtrooms began quoting British law to embarrass British judges. Indian writers began mimicking colonial tone to mock it, and a whole generation of brown sahibs emerged, fluent in irony, sarcasm, and strategy. Because when you are ruled by people who don't get the joke, humor becomes resistance. Imperialism had tried to rewrite culture, but in the end, it created its most iconic export: a colonized elite who could out English the English and still call them out with a smile. Chapter 9: Empire Cracks. Every empire believes it will last forever until it starts tripping over its own myths. By the early 20th century, the British Raj was a creaking machine, still gilded on the outside but rusting within. The Indian National Congress, once a polite debating society of Western educated elites, began asking uncomfortable questions. Why are we citizens in theory, but subject in practice? Why are Indians good enough to die in your wars, good enough to sit in your councils? Then came the partition of Bengal in 1905, a masterclass in divine rule. They said it was administrative convenience. Indians saw it for what it was: an attempt to fracture unity by slicing Bengal along religious lines. Protests erupted, boycotts, even poetry became a weapon. Tagore's verses lit up streets like torches. But the real earthquake came not from politicians, but from a man dressed in simple khadi, armed with truth, salt, and a spinning wheel: Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. He didn't storm palaces, he walked to the sea. He challenged the empire by breaking laws without breaking heads and taught millions to do the same. Civil disobedience became a symphony of silence. Marches replaced mutinies, and the world watched as barefoot farmers stood taller than the empire's might. But the British still had bullets. Jallianwala Bagh, 1919, a garden turned killing field. A peaceful gathering gunned down without warning. Men, women, children. Over 1,000 lives ended in minutes. It was more than a massacre, it was a revelation. That day, something snapped. Loyalty turned to rage. Hope turned to fire. Even within the empire's own ranks, soldiers returning from World War I began asking, why fight for liberty in Europe only to be denied it at home? And so the cracks deepened. The Khilafat movement, non cooperation, Simon boycott, Salt March, Quit India. A tidal wave of resistance that no amount of sedition laws could contain. Revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh picked up the guns. Poets like Iqbal picked up the pen. Millions picked up their voices and refused to be silent. The British offered reforms, thin bandages for gaping wounds, elections without power, rights without teeth. The empire was still standing, but it was swaying, held together not by consent but by coercion, fear, and the fading memory of control. India was no longer asking for freedom, it was demanding for it. Loudly, relentlessly, and irreversibly. Chapter 10. The End or Just the Exit. Empires rarely end with clarity. They unravel, stitch by stitch, lie by lie, until the fabric comes apart in the hands that once claimed to weave it. By 1945, Britain had won a world war and lost the will to rule. Its economy was shattered, its coffers drained, its colonies, especially India, were boiling with defiance. The Indian National Army had marched with Japanese support. Naval mutinies broke out in Bombay. Workers struck, students protested, and Gandhi's whisper had become a nationwide roar. Quit India. The British, exhausted and exposed, finally agreed, not because they had change of heart, but because they had no choice. But how do you exit a country you have controlled for nearly 2 centuries? The answer, in a rush, with a pen and a stunning lack of preparation. Enter Lord Louis Mountbatten, a man with charm, medals, and deadline. He arrived in India in 1947 with one job: get out before things exploded. Spoiler, they exploded anyway. The country was to be divided, hastily, arbitrarily, by a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, who had never set foot in India before. He was given 5 weeks to draw borders between two nations, 14 provinces, hundreds of districts, and millions of people, all speaking different languages, praying to different gods, living side by side for centuries. The result? The partition of India, one of the bloodiest episodes in modern history. 15 million displaced, over a million dead, entire trains arriving at stations with nothing but corpses. This wasn't just withdrawal, it was detonation. Princely states were left to choose: join India, Pakistan, or twist in the wind. Some signed, some stalled, some sparked wars that ravage even today. As Union Jacks came down, confusion went up. Officers abandoned, records missing, police divided, borders drawn through homes, fields, and hearts. Independence had come, but not with dignity or unity or closure. It came with blood, baggage, and borders made in panic. And then came the narratives. Britain painted itself as the benevolent giver of freedom, ignoring the famines, the massacres, the theft of wealth. India was told, be grateful. Grateful for trains, for courts, for English. But gratitude doesn't erase history. The legacy of British rule wasn't just statues and stations. It was bureaucracy still tangled in red tape. a judiciary still quoting colonial laws, a political landscape still haunted by division. Yes, the British theft. But the echoes of empire still linger. In communal violence, caste politics, crumbling institutions, and in the very idea that power means control, not service. This story began with merchants chasing spices. It ended with a divided land, still healing from the wounds of rule that came dressed as civilization. And so we ask, how not to rule a country? Start with arrogance, add ignorance, stir in greed, and never ever listen to people you claim to govern. Well, congratulations. You just sat through 400 years of imperial misadventure, bureaucratic brilliance, and moral confusion, and you don't even need a colonial administrator to translate it for you. If this story made you laugh, rage, or rethink everything you learned in history class, go ahead and do what every empire hopes you won't. Think critically. And then, in the spirit of all great modern rituals, click that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into historical chaos. And if you have got thoughts, rant, corrections, or whatever, leave a comment below. We promise not to tax it. Because unlike the British in India, we actually want to hear from the people we serve.